The new Gawler Heritage Centre, with its archival and exhibition space, will allow people to come to Gawler, to linger and to research their history. Hopefully they won't just drive through the main street. And it's over to the council now to make it work. Cultural heritage is a driver of tourism, and for too long in this state we've ignored and underfunded our history. The philosophy of understanding and valuing our cultural identity underpins the redevelopment of the heritage areas in this new civic building, for which I was responsible. When the architects were chosen for the project MPH, they saw it as a major facility overhaul, and their grand design was new and it was modern. The town of Gawler and the Gawler Heritage Collections Committee had to make sure that as custodians of this rich inheritance that it was preserved. I was brought in to advise the council through the committee, and from the time of construction to the handover, we were the guardians of Gawler's heritage. No, you're moving too fast.
I'll move.
Oh, is it going itself?
No, still every time you tell me I'll move.
Oh, okay. The committee placed a great deal of faith in me and also a burden of responsibility. For anyone seeking to understand just how complex the achievement of the new Gawler civic facility has been, it wasn't just dreaming that there were a series of new deliberate strategic steps to achieving an outcome which started in 2012 and culminated in 2019. I can't do justice tonight to detailing what was achieved in the last 7 years. I can only make some quick references so that you understand what were the first steps in the process to gaining an insight into the Gawler Institute Heritage Collection and its preservation for the future. Can you just go to the slide that we had on before with the report? Go back. That's it. Just leave it there. My first appraisal of the significance of the Gawler Institute Heritage Collection resulted in the Gawler Heritage Collection Management Plan in 2013. And I think this is important because the civic facility and the collection go hand in hand. And for a long time, I suppose, why I was referring to that little tour to Paxton Street was that the collection, since it had been taken away out of the facility, had kind of become a bit of out of sight, out of mind. And so one of the strategic drivers was to bring the collection back into focus and to bring it back in line with the redevelopment of the building. The two are critical to each other. And so this interweaving of built heritage and history and collections is vitally important. My first appraisal was this Gawler Heritage Collection Management Plan of 2013. It wasn't a complicated document, but I do want to refer to some of the recommendations because really it paved the way for supporting the revitalisation of the buildings, but on the basis that the Gawler Institute Heritage Collection was interwoven into this redevelopment. Recommendation 1 was, it was recommended that work be undertaken to determine and document the Gawler Public Library's legal status and whether the Gawler Heritage Collection is appropriately constituted. So it was looking around legal considerations of how the collection was deposited, what happened in the arrangement between the former Gawler Institute Committee and the town of Gawler in 1985. Recommendation 2. It recommended that work be undertaken to clarify the legal relationship between the Gawler Public Library, the Town of Gawler Corporation, and the entity called the Gawler Heritage Collection. The reason for this, and it might sound a bit wordy, was to establish who was custodian and who had the responsibility. Recommendation 3 was it recommended that work be undertaken to determine and document whether the Gawler Heritage Collection under the Local Government Act requires a committee of council as part of the governance model. It's no good having a grand design if you don't have an advocate for it within the council itself, within the budget process. Recommendation 4, that the Gawler Heritage Collection be formally considered part of the Town of Gawler strategic plan, business plan, asset management plan, with a recurrent funding allocated in the annual budget. It did not have any funding allocated, only a very small amount in the annual budget. It is recommended that a reassessment of the Gawler Heritage Collection's statement of significance be undertaken to determine local, state or national significance. Now, the idea of significance is critical to collections, because if you don't actually understand why the collection is significant, you cannot argue the case to the various stakeholders why it should be retained and why it should be, money should be invested in it. Significance is a very complex process as it pertains not only to built heritage but to cultural artefacts. Many people who might see significance on one side of the fence may not see it on the other. And a recent, I suppose, example of that was the State Heritage Council's advocation to retain the building down at Port Adelaide, but that the Minister deciding that in the interests of other interests that the building would go. So there's this constant tension between who determines what is meaningful and who determines what is valuable to a community. The Town of Gawler Recommendation 21, which was the most important, and understand this is back in 2013. The Town of Gawler investigated options and funding for the development of a permanent cultural gallery, heritage research centre and designated on-site archival and storage facility for the Gawler Heritage Collection. On looking back at that report, I look at the 21 recommendations, and over the next 4 years, nearly almost all of those recommendations were implemented, which for a very simple, plain-speaking document, it was a very powerful little document. And maybe some people didn't actually realise how significant and powerful it was. But it set the strategic direction for saying you have a very important cultural asset, a very important economic asset here. Over the next 2 years, most of the plan was implemented, but what it really achieved was to put the Gawler Heritage Collection on the agenda of the Council. It not only achieved recurrent funding in the budget, but it achieved the creation of the Gawler Heritage Collections Committee of Council, and it began creating an understanding that the collection was not an addendum to the library. Next one. Keep going. Just stay. In the course of conducting the review of the Gawler Institute collection and researching the provenance of various items within the Gawler Heritage Collection, it was asserted that there was strong support for the claim that there were items in the collection that were of significance at a state and national level. Now, significance is defined as it can be aesthetic, it can be scientific, it can be cultural, but it always has to be historical. Many of these items within the collection dated from the early colonial period and were valuable because they were a direct link to this very important period in South Australia's foundation and settlement in the early 19th century. I had heard mention of parts of the Gawler Heritage Collection and the Gawler Institute, but I'd never found that anyone could really argue the case of its historical context. And that just didn't mean when it was created, it was what it was contributing to the state's history. And so in this review of the collection, one of the most important outcomes was actually establishing that this collection was significant because it was the product of an institution called the Gawler Institute, established in 1857, and the Gawler Museum, which was going to have and did have a profound effect on the state's history in all sorts of ways. Example of such items included rare artworks, maps, artefacts and items associated with significant people, for example Colonel William Light, Surveyor General of the Province of South Australia, Governor George Gawler, and colonial artist James Shaw. This part of the collection and its interpretation provided a unique insight into the establishment and foundation of South Australia's history and the process of systematic colonisation. It cemented the importance of the collection. The other major area of significance for the Gawler Heritage Collection that appeared in my research was the fact that the Gawler Institute 1857 was directly involved through the establishment of the Gawler Museum in 1859 with the first public museum in South Australia. And this was the development of the first comprehensive natural science and anthropological collection in South Australia and possibly in Australia. The Gawler Institute, through its museum, collected Aboriginal artefacts and other early artefacts, and this was my first insight into the importance of this collection and the interweaving of Ghana and Gawler's history. The Gawler Institute was not merely established as a mechanics institute for the self-improvement of the working classes. This is often a myth that's put about. The Gawler Institute and its operations reflected the aspirations of a unique group of educated European free settlers whose constituency was unlike any other group at that time in Australia. Their object was to satisfy intellectual and cultural pursuits regarding the arts, philosophy, and the pursuit of natural science. Gawler had one of the highest literacy rates in Australia in the 1850s. It is really incredible when you think about those people that were here in Gawler who joined together to create the Gawler Institute, and you look at this level of literacy. An examination of the archival records of the Gawler Institute provided an insight into the history of 19th century Gawler. The records revealed the critical relationship also, and this was my other second discovery, the German-speaking settlers in Gawler. Everyone talks about the Germans in Barossa. Well, by God, the Germans in the areas around Gawler are more important in some respects, because these members of the bushvelder community and their pursuit of natural sciences in colonial South Australia was at the cutting edge of the pursuit of science in Australia. This is nowhere more evident than in the actual donations to the Gawler Institute Museum. The German-speaking migrants who settled in Bushvelder from 1848 near Gawler had supported the 1848 revolutionary uprising in the German principalities in the search of a liberal democracy. They were liberal intellectuals and educated elites who valued political freedom, social democracy, and the pursuit of science and rational scientific thought. They were not escaping religious persecution. They are very different from the Barossa Germans. During South Australia's colonial period, this group of German-speaking settlers in Gawler, along with British free settlers, exerted a profound influence over the establishment and conduct of the Gawler Museum and the Gawler Institute as an educative cultural agency, not as an agency of social control. A search of the Gawler Heritage Collection archives uncovered evidence that there were significant scientific collections donated to the Gawler Institute in the 19th century. The nucleus of this natural science collection was given by the Gawler Naturalist Club to the Gawler Institute in 1859 when it established the museum. This important collection of specimens was contributed to by various people, including Marianne von Kreuzler, a natural scientist who lived at Bushvelder and is possibly Australia's first woman natural scientist. Taxidermist Johannes Odewan, climatologist Otto Schomburg and his brother Dr. Richard Schomburg, who is probably more well known, who collected zoological and anthropological specimens and who later became director of the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. These were movers and shakers. Richard Schomburg collected zoological specimens during these years and carried out meteorological work. He sent specimens of reptiles and frogs back to Wilhelm Peters in Berlin. He was well aware that the specimens he sent would be very welcome in Berlin. At this time, the diversity of frogs and snakes in southern Australia was unknown. Working from Bushfelder, Dr. Richard Schomburg was the first to collect many of the species endemic to within 50 kilometres of Adelaide. These specimens proved to be of great scientific interest, and they are now becoming of even greater scientific interest in a world that is being subject to climate change. Throughout the 1860s and the 1870s, further significant donations to the Gawler Museum were made by leading educationists Dr. Carl Muecke, natural scientist Frederick Schultz, and philanthropist George French Angus and John H. Angus, his brother, explorer John McKinlay, surveyor John Warren, geologist and scientist the Reverend Julian Tennyson Woods, and colonial governor George Gawler, among many others. The donations covered ornithological, entomological specimens, reptile specimens, mammalian specimens, mineral collections, shell collections, rare Aboriginal artefacts, anthropological artefacts from the Pacific Islands and British Guiana, botanical specimens and drawings, even 2 rare Egyptian stones that were considered antiquities from the pyramids, a rare coin collection that was also given to the Gawler Institute at this time. This collection was unique in South Australia and possibly in Australia. The operation of the Gawler Museum was an important part of the Gawler Institute, which dominated cultural life in Gawler and exerted a profound influence over aspects of cultural life in the colony in this period. In the late 1890s and following World War I and in successive years, many items which were part of this collection were loaned or in some cases removed to the South Australian Museum and other agencies in Australia and overseas, and were exchanged, sold or given away by those agencies. The transfer of these items and the conditions under which these items were exchanged, sold or given is an area of disputation. The Gawler Cultural Heritage Management Plan documented, explained and argued the case for the significance of the Gawler Heritage Collection all that time ago. The strategy briefly described the way some of the stories associated with the Gawler Heritage Collection and Gawler's rich history could be showcased and developed, utilising a range of delivery mediums and product types to stimulate ongoing interest and engagement with iconic sites across the Gawler region. The strategy would cover a number of key areas such as the Gawler Heritage Collection public programs, cultural tourism, branding and product development, the town of Gawler cultural heritage installations and the development of cultural heritage facilities. In November 2015, I was requested by the newly established Gawler Heritage Collections Committee to advise on the Gawler Connect project and the Gawler Heritage Collection. The mission was to ensure that the Gawler Heritage Collection would be provided for in the new development and that the character of some of the key heritage areas would be safeguarded and that the fit out of the proposed new gallery would meet expectations. Indeed, Gawler has a remarkable history. From its rich Kaurna history of country of emu and dingo dreaming to its achievements in the 19th century. The exhibition Into the Light was just a small foray into the important complex cultural layers that have given Gawler its distinctive character and sense of historical continuity. The concept for the first exhibition was captured, and is captured in the title which I gave it, Into the Light, because during my 7 years with Gawler, I have had my mind enlightened by Gawler's wonderful history. It also played upon the connections to Colonel Light, and it also plays upon the connections to the Kaurna people and their association with this region, which has not really been articulated to any great degree yet, but is beginning to become understood. So within this context, light represented insight. Into the light was a metaphor for reason and understanding, much of which was what the Gawler Heritage Collection is about. And it hopefully brings a subtle and nuanced approach to understanding Gawler's history by critiquing sympathetically the forces that have combined to shape and define the landscape and the society. I've interpreted Gawler's history through a number of prisms. The Kaurna people and their understanding and ties to country, 19th century British colonisation and the establishment of the province of South Australia and conflicting notions of country, the imperatives of exploration, mapping and surveying, particularly with regard to Colonel William Light's role as Surveyor General and his unique relationship with Gawler, the dramatic changes to life and landscape wrought by European settlement and the creation of Gawler Town, the emergence of Gawler's sense of cultural identity and attendant cultural aspirations as represented in the development of cultural institutions such as the Gawler Institute. The exhibition traces these profound events by providing a window into Gawler's history as it happened. It has tried to present items from the Gawler Heritage Collection as a blend of artwork, artefacts and archival treasures. And I'm now going to talk to the slides. The first slide that you see up here is when we met with the committee to develop a concept for how we were going to interpret the heritage areas. I'd spent quite a fair bit of time at the V&A Museum and also in Britain and in Ireland. And I have to say that Ireland post-2009, the global financial crisis, had managed to get itself out of a terrible situation of debt. It had focused on development at its own, at the expense of its own history. In 2009, it went back to cultural tourism. Within 2 years, it had paid off its debt. It has possibly one of the best state cultural tourism and history plans, and its museums are second to none. At the British Museum, I came across these colours, and I kept thinking about Gawler and thinking that when I went into the reading room, I think the reading room was a magnificent place, but I just felt the life had been sapped out of it. So if any of you know, and you might think, you might hate the particular colour that I've painted it, but gold is the colour for intellectual stimulation. And it's one that represents intellectual observation. So we decided, I presented a number of concepts to the Gawler Heritage Collection Committee and to the Council, and they were endorsed. We provided a design approach that integrated all the furnishings, the use of rooms, it wasn't going to recreate what had been because that had already been changed in 1985. What we wanted to do was bring out the heritage features but bring it into the 21st century. Next one. Throughout the whole process, and it was a really fascinating process because normally my engagement sometimes stops depending upon the client at the idea of concept and design. At the Waite, I was involved in overseeing as project manager the refit of the Coach House Museum, and I was involved with the City of Norwood, Payneham and St Peters in the development of the St Peters Heritage Centre. I was lucky enough to be involved at the birth of this and at the end of it. Every moment was spent checking that what was agreed to was followed through. We tried to salvage as much of the character of the rooms that we had control over. This is, no, don't go back, just keep, just go forward, go. Where have you gone?
Nowhere, I'm staying there.
No. Go on the cursor. Sorry, I'm trying. Yeah, next. Yeah. This was the council chamber, which has become the Heritage Gallery. We're going to keep going forward. This was the end result, and I wanted to show you the previous slide because we had a great debate with the architects who wanted to paint the ceiling out, and I really felt it really important that we kept that ceiling. It was reflective of what had been, and it's one of the factors that people love when they go into the new Heritage Gallery. In overseeing the fit out of the reading room, I work with a whole group of people who work under me, people that I trust, tradesmen, cabinet makers, all sorts of people. No.
It moves automatically. I can't stop it. I'm just going back.
It's just I can see the cursor moving. That's all right. No, get the cursor.
Do you want me to go to the next one?
Yes. Okay. So the end result, and this is only part of it, we've put up a reader rail so that there can be changing pictures and things in this room. We've tried to keep the character of the room, but to free it up. Now, some people may ask, why, I know Paul was one, why did I move the old bookcases out of there? Keep going, Paul. Keep going. James Martin's at the end. Now, the original reading rooms never had books in them, okay? They were not libraries. They were reading rooms. The books were controlled from the library, which was situated in the ante-room. I thought it was really important. Those bookcases had been brought out there in 1985. They were not part of the original fabric. So we decided to recreate the library so we could put the Gawler Institute Library back where it can be seen, and the notion of it as being an entity. Keep going. Now, to get up an exhibition, to design an exhibition, you don't just suddenly put a few objects in a glass case. You actually have to have a concept. And that concept has to actually embrace the physical surroundings. And that's all right. No, okay, it's all right. So what you do, we colour code the room. And here you will actually see on this side is the Ghana display. Now this is 6 months ahead of what I ended up actually creating, or 12 months ahead. You'll see the two display cases in the room. On this side, on the grey, is where the treasures wall is. So that was, the idea was that you would enter and you would turn to the left, because if you look at how people move through museums, this is what they actually do. They go left. They actually don't normally go right. They go left. So we put the Ghana story first and then tried to merge it into what happened with European colonisation. And then gradually moving around as Gawler Town itself was established, moving then into the development of cultural institutions as the town began to operate, got more money, particularly after the setting up of the Borough and Kapunda mines, and then we eventually get, before you go out the door, to the impact of the people at Bushfelder, the impact of a new wave of migrants. The brief of the Gawler Into the Light exhibition was to only go up to that point of where the new building was created, so that you've got a lot of stories to go up. So the other thing is, and this is for people who aren't maybe used to what happens in the creative process, at this stage I wasn't quite sure what I was working with, but I knew what stories I wanted to tell. And I knew that I wanted to interweave not just a European story about settlement, that it had to be about how topography had influenced not only the Ghana and how they moved through the landscape, but how European settlement took place. So we draw up an ideal. And actually, if you go into the exhibition, you'll probably be quite amazed at how close to reality it's become. Next one. The next thing is searching for images and artefacts. one of the things that stirred me so much about the Gawler Heritage Collection and its early history was the Gawler Museum's early collection of Ghana artefacts. And this is where the emu story comes in, because one of the oldest artefacts collected was an emu net. And it was an emu net that was donated by Richard Holland at Turretfield. And it was quite interesting. I was quite fascinated by this emu net. And the fact is that it still exists at the South Australian Museum after all these years. It was donated in 1859. That museum, that emu net, which is probably one of the oldest and rarest Ghana artefacts, is in the South Australian Museum. It's part of the Gawler Heritage Collection. It is a Ghana artefact and is part of their culture. One of the great joys of this project has been working with the Ghana and working with them to understand stories about this area, and also giving them some information too. So Emu Dreaming became a big theme, and I wondered how Richard Holland came to have these artefacts, and then I stumbled across a little reference and a bit of research. He was one of the first colonists in the North Para to use wire fencing. This meant, of course, that Ghana could not herd the emus. The emus were herded because they were in a herd. They were often herded into what was called a snare. And they were hunted, and I hadn't actually understood this, they were hunted at key ceremonial times because they could provide a large amount of food for a large group of people. So it goes to show you how things are all interconnected. So it wasn't just about hunting, it was about ceremony. The other thing that began to interest me, of course, is the enormous number of colonial paintings. And from an early age, I've been dragged through art galleries. I love artworks. But artworks are not just artworks. They document the history and occupation of a people. And you will see in nearly all of 19th century colonial artworks, there will always be representation of Aboriginal people. They may be very small, they may be to the side, but they are there, and it shows their connection to country. Next one. So the emu tracks began to form a little bit of a theme, and you'll find that in some of the panels. Keep going. The other thing that then connected me to the artwork was the fact that we often hear about Colonel Light. Yes, he established the town of Adelaide and planned. He was the first Surveyor General. The other thing about him that's often not talked about a great deal is he was an absolutely extraordinary artist, a gifted Renaissance man. He could play music, he could write poetry, he had an extraordinary mind, and if you go through some of his surviving books that have captured his paintings, early or before he came to South Australia, he sailed his yacht, the Gulnair, with his then second wife, partner, over to Egypt. He travelled up the Nile. This is at an extraordinary time when many of these ancient ruins were just being discovered. He went on a journey of discovery. He is an incredible, extraordinary intellect, and he absorbed all of this understanding of history and landscape. He served in the Peninsular Wars, and of course this connection is to Gawler, because there was a little painting hanging above the photocopier which I used to look at, and it was called The Battle of Barossa. And somebody said, "Oh, Governor Gawler gave that to the gave it to the Gawler Institute." And I thought, well, he might have given it to the Gawler Institute, but he didn't paint it. Subsequent work taken out and research actually proved that it was done by Colonel Light at the Battle of Barossa. And so Gawler has in its heritage collection one of the very rare paintings of Colonel Light. And it's an extraordinary artefact because it talks about how when he went exploring and surveying that land, he named it after the battle that he participated in. So Barossa, when it was transcribed into the surveyor's maps, was spelt wrongly. So Barossa is not really Barossa, it should be Barossa. So you actually have a hand in explaining why Barossa is not should be Barossa. And it's a fantastic artefact. It's on display in the collection. The other thing about light is his extraordinary sensitivity to the landscape. He observed, being born in, he was Eurasian, born in Malaysia, in Penang, and he was brought up, same as Captain Charles Sturt, who was born in India. They were brought up in a different cultural landscape. They did not see dark-skinned people as being anything other than another human race. And this was something very important in the 19th century, because most British white people had not been exposed to civilizations of black people, other than as slaves. So he had an extraordinarily different view of the world. He also had a different view of the landscape. So he was a great observer, as well as being among other things. And he observed the Kaurna in their daily ritual. And I had a bit of an argument with former Councillor Adrian Shackley, but I believe that one of the reasons why he rode north to survey this land was because he watched the Kaurna going up the Great North Track. Now, we do know now that many of our main roads were Aboriginal tracks. And it's really fascinating because Gawler is, of course, at the junction of three rivers. And we know that there are very significant places in Gawler, but it's also the Great Track north to where there are very rich deposits of ochre used for ceremony. And I believe that this procession of people probably assisted light in his way north. One of the things I've included in the exhibition is artefacts that pertain to surveying. And I know that lots of people will look at something, but when you look at this 19th century technology and understand this was a different perception of country. This was not a perception of country that the Kaurna could understand. Theirs was through songlines, pathways, through totems, through animals, through stories. Europeans come along, they have a notion of property. Property has to be defined by fences. It has to be subdivided. It has to be mapped. And of course, you have to have rights to it, so you have to have title. And so all of these instruments were created in the late 1700s and 1800s to assist with that process of redefining the world into north, south, east and west, and into maps. And that leads to the idea of the treasures wall, where you will see a map of Gawler laid out as one of the first survey maps. But it's also almost like an aerial view, because the Aboriginal people will often see the sky and the land as one. This was our concept for cultural life. We can see the globe there, and the reason I chose the globe was I was fascinated in that there was a previous photograph of the reading room, and through research that I did, it was stated that it had 2 terrestrial globes. I searched long and high on the internet to see if I could find one. I don't know what happened to Gawler's terrestrial globes. One of them probably sits in the State Library, who knows. But thankfully we did find that the Royal Geographic Society had a globe. You never know, it might be Gawler's, because it was donated by one of our German scientists, Otto Tepper. It's an extraordinary globe, and when you go into the exhibition, have a look at it. And I was fascinated to know that the Institute had these globes, because what it said to me, it wasn't just, well, there's a globe in the corner, that looks nice. It said to me this was a world view. This was why Gawler was so advanced, because people didn't confine themselves to a small region. Their cultural life extended to a global view. And I thought, this was quite profound. I've looked in a lot of other photographs of reading rooms of the same period, and I haven't found these globes. So again, I think this was this kind of European intellectualism that descended upon Gawler. Keep going. One of the other, and I'm going to finish very soon, I can't cover the whole exhibition, I can just give you a few ideas. One of the other artefacts which I found or discovered or was shown very early on was the Bechstein piano and the Steinway under the covers in the Gawler Institute. I was obsessed with the Bechstein. I could not believe you had a Bechstein, and I thought to myself, my God, that's an amazing artefact. What is its history? Now, Bechstein, if you don't know, Google it, because Bechstein is the great maker of pianos. Carl Bechstein from Germany created this piano for Liszt to be able to play his compositions. It's got a particular structural arrangement, and it was critically important in the world of classical music. This Bechstein that you've got was made in 1881. Every Bechstein under the lid has a number. And when I went, after the Bechstein was taken out of the Gawler Institute, I went to have a look at it at the depot and found the number. I wrote to Bechstein in Germany, who were highly excited about this Bechstein. I explained that we were going to put it into an exhibition. They have asked me for photographs and whatever else. This Bechstein, and it's a bit of a long story, but Augustus George Krantz was the son of Augustus Frederick Krantz, A.F. Krantz. A.F. Krantz came out in 1848. He was a professor of music. He was like the other 1848ers. He was liberal and escaped, came to South Australia because of political persecution. He arrived, and of course he was friends with Herr Karl Linger. Augustus Frederick Krantz's wife was an opera singer. So who did she pally up with? She pallied up with Herr Linger, and they performed recitals together. And the long and the short of this story is that when the son of Augustus Krantz, his father had died, he had come to live out in Gawler, and he was part of the Institute Committee. I think he was treasurer. This particular piano was bought for the new German club in town in Perry Street, which was a magnificent building. This was a semi-grand piano. Karl Linger was, of course, one of the first composers and put together the first orchestra in South Australia, which performed at White's Rooms, which was the Tivoli, and they performed Handel's Messiah, the first performance of Handel's Messiah in 1860. And Krantz was involved with this. And when this piano, they found that it was too small for the new German club. So the son, Augustus George, decided, because of Herr Linger's connection to the Song of Australia, that he would organise some fundraising for it and purchase it and bring it to the Gawler Institute, which he did in 1881. There is a wonderful connection here between all of these characters, and I don't want to go too much into it because it's actually a very interesting story about how the two families intermingled. When I first mentioned the Bechstein, a few people looked at me in disbelief and said, "Oh God, not that thing, it's so ugly." And they couldn't believe that I wanted to put it into an exhibition. How can you put a semi-grand piano into an exhibition? I said, leave it to me, I will. Next. Oops, I've gone back. That's right. Wait a minute. The piano, luckily, there is one piano restorer in South Australia who lives on Osmond Terrace, Joe Lever. He's known around the world. He is fanatical about Bechsteins as I am, and when I told him there was a Bechstein, he said, "Oh my God." Anyway, the Bechstein had become a little bit damaged in storage, and we were lucky enough to get some insurance money to help restore it. And Joe Lever, as a labour of love, spent an extraordinary number of hours, and I think anyone who's been into the exhibition will see the absolute superb state of what the Bechstein is now, and how beautiful an artefact, and it can be played, it is. It's been a remarkable story. He had to search around Australia and overseas for a couple of parts for it. It could not have been in better hands, and I urge anyone who's never been to Lever and Sons, next to the Norwood Bowl on Osmond Terrace, go in there. It's like a shop unlike you've have ever seen. It's just amazing. Anyway, this is the Treasures Wall. Keep going. This was Auntie Lynette Crocker. One of the other continuing themes in the exhibition, linking Ghana and European history, is the fact that feathers, emu feathers, became a big thing. I spent a number of weekends sorting feathers with Auntie Lynette, to the point that I thought, I don't ever want to see another emu feather again in my life. Keep going. On the wall you will see a print. I purchased this antique print. It was misnamed as Gawler. It is actually Gawler. The Scottish painter who painted it, when it was sent back to be printed back in Britain, they didn't transcribe the name right. And this tree appears a number of times in different images and paintings of Gawler. And this was called the Gawler Plains. And I think he's looking over the Gawler Plains, and this is called Smoking for Native Bees. There is at the top of this a cloud, and it shows the Ghana going up. And the reasons I used the wall, the windows in each end of the exhibition, was to juxtapose one view of country as opposed to another view of country. Keep going. This was the emu cloak. When I first suggested we make an emu cloak, I had no idea what I was talking about. And so after working with a group of Ghana women, particularly Auntie Lynette Crocker, we decided that to create something that is also a modern artwork, but it is using all of the beautiful emu skins. And as we were making it over many weekends, just the feel of it, it was quite amazing. And she said, you know what, Denise? She said, I can see country. And she would ripple the skins, and she said, look, here are the rivers, here are the ridges, here are the mountains. It became a very special project. She made the dreaming mat, which is up above it. It's an extraordinary piece of artwork. And you, as I said, you will see feathers as a constant theme throughout. Because not only do the Ghana, whoops, next one, but of course the cockatoos were very, very important. This is a John Gould print of the cockatoos. You'll see cockatoos on either side. The black cockatoo and the Major Mitchell cockatoo were part of Gawler's landscape, and their feathers were used for ceremony. Keep going. Don't go back. Don't go back. Don't you go back. This is Governor Gawler's hat that he wore at his first meeting with all of the First Nations people held in Adelaide. I had to jump up and down to get it out of the History Trust, but I said, you are custodian of the state's heritage relics. This hat, which the Ghana called the Cockatoo Governor, has all of the feathers on it. And I thought, this is a fantastic juxtaposition against the cloak. It goes to show that we all like feathers one way and another, and that pomp and ceremony aren't limited by culture. This is our beautiful Colonel Light. This was his portrait of himself just before his death. If you look at it closely, you will see there are two portraits, one at the bottom, one at the top. It's almost as though he's looking out at us. It's an extraordinary image that I keep coming back to a lot. I actually had to get this image from Germany to get it framed. I purchased a paint box just to show people that you might be surveying and exploring, but you carried your paint box. This is an 1830s paint box down here. It shows the little ceramic containers. He took his paint box everywhere with him. So did Charles Sturt, because painting was part of recording not only the landscape and their own creative inspirations, but it was documenting flora and fauna. You'll also see some other artefacts there, such as his sword. That particular one is not his sword, but it's very similar to his sword. And the play upon this was, they may have gone surveying, they had paint boxes, they also had weapons. Keep going. This is the, no, don't go back, don't go back, no, quick, next one. This is the other window, the James Shaw, which juxtaposes against the image of smoking the native bees to James Shaw, who came here in 1859-1860. He painted a number of houses. He's one of South Australia's earliest colonial painters. Very important because he actually recorded the landscape. He's the closest thing to a photographer. And here he is looking over Gawler town, and you actually have the original James Shaw painting in your collection. And the reason I enlarge things is so people can get an understanding of looking at the detail. But he gave that painting to the Institute because one of his first exhibitions was given by the Institute in the old hall further on down in Murray Street. So he was so thankful to the Gawler Institute that he gave that painting. George French Angus is another interesting character. G.F. Angus, who was of course founder of the South Australian Company, and of course South Australia wouldn't have existed without this private company and without his ability to pre-sell a certain amount of land and to fund out people to South Australia. Interestingly, a lot of people don't realise, but Colonel Light probably was baptised Catholic. That would have added also to the fact of why he was probably not seen as part of the official establishment by the British aristocracy. Interestingly, G.F. Angus was also a painter. His father rejected him. He married a Catholic, so he didn't bask in his father's favour. His father was, I think it was a Congregationalist, and he really didn't like Catholics too much, to the point that GF came over here, went up to see his brother, John H. Angus, but for the rest of his life, after painting here for 6 months, and we are so lucky to have many of these images of Gawler, which are in this book, which is a reprint of his famous book that was printed back in England to help people to sell the colony. So artists were useful not only just for painting, but they were selling the colony to prospective new buyers. There's the lovely Bechstein and Caroline Carlton, who's been reframed. And the last one is our little cabinet of curiosities. I wanted to create this because I wanted people to understand there were real items in the Gawler Heritage Collection. You will of course see the crocodile. I was fascinated to know that somebody donated a small crocodile to the Gawler Heritage Collection, Institute collection. And I thought, where can I find a taxidermied stuffed crocodile? Well, I did find one up in Queensland, and he came down through the post intact, and he's now in the top drawer of the cabinet of curiosities. I also managed to find a Leitz microscope, because one of the other fabulous donations to the Gawler Institute was this microscope, a really important artefact. And above it, of course, sits many specimens similar to what Marianne Kreuzler would have done with her her bottling and preserving of various animals and other bits and pieces. Just these were the things that stimulated people's interests. So have a close look at that one when you go into the exhibition. That is it, making history.